pós-graduação em Comunicação Social e Programa de Pós-Graduação em Ciência Política e pelo Grupo de Pesquisa Mídia e Esfera Pública. A professora Stromer-Galley possui doutorado na University School of Communication na Universidade de Pensilvânia. Ela é professora associada do Information Studies e afiliada ao Departamento de Ciência Política da Maxwell School na Universidade de Syracuse. É ainda vice-presidente da Associação de Pesquisadores de Internet. A professora Stromer-Galley vem estudando mídias sociais antes mesmo que esse termo fosse amplamente conhecido. Seus estudos abordam a influência do ambiente digital, deliberação pública e participação através da mídia social e ainda games online com múltiplos jogadores. A professora Jennifer Stromer-Galley já publicou mais de 40 artigos, capítulos de livros e trabalhos em anais de congresso. Seu livro, Presidential Campaign in the Internet Age, publicado pela Universidade de Oxford, editora da Universidade de Oxford, trata da história das campanhas presidenciais e como elas vêm se adaptando ao novo cenário digital. A professora Stromer-Galley vem trabalhando com aspectos da educação através de jogos que podem aperfeiçoar as capacidades cognitivas dos jogadores. I'd like to thank you, Jennifer, for staying here with us. It's a great pleasure to attend your talk today. And we will not have simultaneous translation, so the talk will be in English. And in this week, Professor Stromer-Galley will be teaching a short course on social media research method, and this is also the topic of this afternoon talk. So, thank you very much. And on behalf of our coordinator, supervisor, Professor Elton Dunes, I would like to thank you for this talk and for the mini course as well. And now we will have the talk of social media research methods. Thank you.
Bom dia. Obrigada. Thank you very much for having me come to your beautiful city. I have feasted on barbecue, and I have run around your lake, and I have seen friendly people and beautiful weather. I forget that it's winter here. Syracuse University in the winter time is very cold. Ask Patricia about this. So winter time here is like summertime in Syracuse. Beautiful. So I'm going to speak slowly so that you can understand. Please, please, if you do not understand, stop me and say stop. Don't understand. And I will go back because my Portuguese, bleh. My English, meh. Okay, so internet research methods. There are plenty of methods. Surveys, interviews, ethnography, many methods developed over many years. So why add internet or social media to thinking about research methods? I want to give you an example to start. You need to think about research methods for social media and other digital technologies like mobile. Now, has anybody here heard about the Facebook emotional contagion study? Yes? Say more. What do you know about this? That's correct. That's correct. So do you remember any details about what they did?
They showed different emotional type of stories to different people to see how they would react if they're happy or sad.
Okay. Yeah, good. Do others of you know about this study? I think it's very interesting that the first thing you said was it was unethical. So it's a good place to start in thinking about this. So some details. I'm sorry for all the text, but it's hard to explain. So, Facebook, in partnership with a professor at Cornell University, a guy by the name of Jeff Hancock, Jeff Hancock at Cornell University, 2 Facebook researchers joined together to do this study. They took over 600,000 Facebook accounts, and they manipulated the news feed that people saw for 1 week. There are 2 conditions. So one condition, a quarter, 1/4, had their news feeds show only negative posts from basically the people that they follow. Another quarter was a control condition, so they had the same number of posts removed, but randomly, so they got the same sort of proportion of positive and negative that they would normally see, but a portion were removed. A quarter, 1/4, saw only positive messages from their friends and family members and coworkers. And then again, there was a control condition of a quarter who had the same number omitted. Normally with experiments, you typically have 1 control condition and then maybe 2 manipulations. But because we humans, when we post on Facebook, we tend to post positive messages. Yay, we're happy people, I guess. So because of this, there are more positive messages. And so to remove those positive messages meant more messages had to be removed for those in a negative condition, if that makes any sense. So that's the experiment. 1 week, 600,000 people. Manipulation in Facebook. They found what they were looking for. There's a theory of emotional contagion. The idea is that if you are exposed to lots of negative messages, negative feelings, then you in turn will produce negative messages and have negative feelings. And so they then studied, after this period, they then looked within that week and a week after, whether or not the 600,000 people that they were watching changed their messages that they then produced, to see whether or not, so if I was in the negative condition, did I then write more negative messages having seen all these negative messages? And they found yes. As it turns out, if you are primarily seeing in your news feed negative messages, then you yourself will write more negative messages. So, this is a paragraph that I pulled out of this paper that describes their method. Posts were determined to be positive or negative if they contained at least 1 positive or negative word, as defined by the Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count software, Luke, which is a word counting system. Luke was adapted to run on the Hadoop map reduce system and in the newsfeed filtering system such that no text was seen by the researchers. As such, it was consistent with Facebook's data use policy, to which all users agree prior to creating an account on Facebook, constituting informed consent for their research. So, as you noted, there was controversy. News stories began to be written within higher education as well as in the popular news media in the United States with headlines like this: Facebook fiasco. Was Cornell's study of emotional contagion and ethics breach? And then I love the description under, a covert experiment to influence the emotions of more than 600,000 people, a major scientific journal behaving like a rabbit in the headlights, a university in a PR tailspin. Facebook manipulated. Manipulated, not a positive word in English, really not, that's manipulation bad. Facebook manipulated user news feeds to create emotional responses. This is my favorite. Why the Facebook experiment is lousy social science. And then underneath, Facebook is grappling with its impact on our social and emotional lives. And that's a good thing, but it has to get the research right. Why Facebook did the experiment and how to make it better. So before I talk a little bit more about why we need to think about internet research methods, I want to ask you guys, if you thought you might be a participant in this study, how would you feel? Don't be shy. How would you feel? Bring it on! I'd love to be a rabbit, guinea pig, like a hamster, right? This is this, yeah, or a little mouse following the cheese in the maze. Anybody feel it's okay? No problem. Happy to have Facebook do this to me.
Vulnerable. Vulnerable.
Vulnerable. Ooh, say more about this. Why vulnerable?
Because we don't know exactly what they would do with the findings.
So we don't know what they would do if they would find this information. So now that they have found this information, might they work with, I don't know, businesses? Putting very positive messages from others' news feeds around their product advertising? Maybe I just saw a headline in the United States about concerns that Facebook might try to manipulate the US election that we're having next year. Right? So there's this feeling of manipulation, of being experimented on without your consent. And that's some of the challenges when you're dealing with internet research. Because we get to collect and measure behavior, attitudes, and feelings of people at data scale. I don't know if you've heard this. It's a very hot phrase right now, especially in schools like mine of information studies. The idea of data scale is basically, the entire server of all the Facebook messages ever posted. It's possible to collect that in real time. That's data scale. So massive amounts of information. And you can do this unobserved as a researcher. But it raises ethical challenges. It also raises challenges for our standard research methods. But there are opportunities to develop new methods to deal with some of these challenges. And so what I want to talk with you about today are those challenges, both for ethics and for our standard methods, and to think a bit with you about advancing new methods. My goal today is not to dive really deep into the technicalities of any specific method, but rather to talk broadly about a set of methods that are commonly used in the social sciences and how we need to think a little bit differently about them when you're questioning what's happening on the internet. But I want to back up first. So, why these challenges? There are always challenges with methods. Anybody sitting in this research knows that it's hard. There are all kinds of challenges whenever you're dealing with humans, for many different reasons. I don't know if it has also reached its tentacles into the Brazilian gamer community. It all started around a question of the ethics of game reviews in online news sources. So how many of you are gamers? Oh no, really? We could be friends here. Play games, right? So, but Gamergate. So if you are a fan of games and you're trying to figure out what to buy, you might go to a news site, read a review, and then decide to buy that game or not. And there's some controversy about whether those reviews are paid for, basically. Then the controversy got very messy, and I won't go too much into the details, but it had to do with a female game developer, a woman who was making an independent game, who also happened to have a relationship with a reviewer of games. That reviewer of games gave her game a positive review, and it led to this incredible firestorm around the ethics of game reviews, but more to the point, a lot of personal attacks, including death threats, to the female programmer who was creating these games. And there are numbers of these incidences where women who are very visible, maybe you have followed the controversy at Reddit. Reddit is a kind of online discussion forum. The CEO is a woman. She instituted a policy to close some of the really nasty discussion forums leading to death threats, harassment. So I'm very interested in this. It is hard to see harassment in daily life, but on the internet, it is so visible. It is so easy to see the harassment and the attacks, the horrible comments. So it can make visible things that otherwise are really hard to see. There's traceability. You can track people, you can track ideas across platforms. I'm especially passionate about history. My book, Presidential Campaigning in the Internet Age, looks at presidential campaigns in the United States since 1996. Getting a hold of those websites that were made in 96 or 2000, very, very hard to find, but there are projects like the Internet Archive that have those. And just the volume of being able to see these behaviors that otherwise are not as easy to see. Creating this, wow, look what I can see online. Right? Just the sheer tantalizingness of being able to watch what people do is very intoxicating, very attractive. But there are lots of challenges. Who are these people who are producing these messages that we're curious about? It's hard to know. There is a very big problem right now with bots. Netflix or Yelp, these platforms where people, or Amazon, where you can go and read reviews. More and more there's concern that those human written reviews are not written by humans, they're written by bots. So as a researcher, if I'm interested in the messages on review systems, how do I know that I'm actually looking at a human's comment and not a bot? There is a big problem with representativeness. This is probably one of my biggest pet peeves. When I see papers coming in, I'm a reviewer, associate editor for the Journal of Computer Mediated Communication. I see a lot of manuscripts. And you have to be very careful trying to understand if the people in your study are actually representative of the population of interest to you. They may not be online. Not everybody's online. Don't tell them. There is a big problem with systematicity. By that I mean, again, going back to archives of political websites, they're not complete. There are pieces of our history that are gone. And so trying to recreate a record of discussions or activities, behavior over time can be very challenging. And in volume, doing content analysis, you can be overwhelmed with the volume of messages that are available to you. How do you slog through it all? So those are some of the digital affordances that lead us to want to study what's happening online, but also then produce these challenges. Forgot about that one. Yes. People are not necessarily who they seem to be. That is, think about your own Facebook page or your Twitter feed. Are you really you? Who are you when you're doing these things in these places? We perform different aspects of ourselves in different places. Right here you are a student, but if I put a bunch of beers in your hand and we started to dance, then you would be partiers, and it would be a different thing. You would be behaving differently, we'd be having a hell of a lot more fun. And I'll pay you later. So there is this recognition that we need to have that we are always performing in some way. And so what is authentic in these kinds of spaces? What does that mean? Okay. So now what I want to do, having mapped out some of these challenges and opportunities, I want to talk now about some of the specific methods that if you want to apply them to some digital behavior, some of the challenges that go into this, and some solutions. Some. So, ethnography and observation challenges. Now, ethnography is really about trying to understand community or culture or norms. Typically in ethnography, you embed yourself with a community of people over time. So back when I was a master's student, maybe I was a PhD student, I had this fantasy to do my dissertation by basically grabbing a backpack, stuffing a bunch of clothes in, and going to Europe for a year and backpacking. Maybe some of you have done this, or you have friends who between high school and university take off time and they just go and travel in Europe for 6 months or a year. There is a culture there of backpackers, the backpacker culture. And God, wouldn't that be a cool dissertation? I'd love to do that. Has nothing to do with the internet. But if you are thinking about culture and community, that's typically what you would do as an ethnographer. You would join that culture, you would spend time with the people of interest to you to understand the norms, to understand the things that they value, maybe to understand their taboos, their rituals. And we can think about doing ethnography online, but one of the biggest questions is, well, where do you look? So, for example, going back to my interest in looking at harassment of prominent women, one of what's interesting to me in U.S. culture are these sort of double standards of expectations of what it means to be a strong woman and how quickly that backlash can happen. That's a kind of cultural behavior that occurs, not necessarily unique to the United States, but is magnified in the U.S. right now. So if I wanted to study this, if I wanted to try to understand who is engaged in harassing or trolling activities, who are the recipients of those, where would I start? It happens in all kinds of places. Reddit is one. Snapchat. Do you guys know Snapchat? Yeah? Do you use Snapchat? What the hell do you use it for? It's such a funny thing. Yeah, and there's harassment happening there a lot. In fact, on college and high school campuses in the United States, Snapchat is often banned because of concerns about harassment and bullying, right? So bullying, another kind of interesting phenomenon that the internet allows for us to see. But where do you start? How do you stop? Where do you bound this? Very, very challenging because it happens in so many different places. How many of you love love? Interested in love and friendships? Again, happens in all kinds of places on the internet. Dating sites, sure, so maybe you start with a dating site. But love happens on Facebook. Love happens on Reddit. It happens in online games. Oh my gosh, the number of friends of mine who've had sometimes illicit affairs in their pseudo-avatar selves, right? That's another kind of love. So where do you start? How do you stop? Where do you bound this? Very challenging. Then, who is included? Who do you exclude? Very challenging questions. There's the problem of anonymity. Typically, when you're doing ethnography, you know the people. You spend time with them. You live with them. You eat with them. You are part of their community. How do you do that online? Do you just live on Facebook? How would you do that? Sounds really unpleasant. Although many of us do spend a fair amount of time on Facebook. You don't live there. Well, is there a community there? How do you get to other communities on Facebook? Especially ones that are private, that are closed off to you. Then there's always this question of what do you miss by only selecting certain groups or certain people to study? Who gets left out? How do you build rapport? How do you actually get to know the people and have them open up to you when you're as anonymous to them as they are potentially to you? How do they trust that you're not a bot? And how do you make sense of this culture when there are no themes? Typically, when you do ethnography, you're paying attention to the objects and the devices, the rituals of daily life that are part of, because we're not disembodied, right? There are all kinds of physical objects that are important to us. Cars, computers, microwaves in my domestic life is very important to me. My hotel doesn't have one. I had cold dinner last night. Microwaves are good. Okay, so a few suggestions. If you're interested in doing ethnography, of really trying to understand some aspect of culture or norms, you have to spend time. I have students who come to me who are fascinated with political discussion and political discussion online, and are wanting to study. For example, in the United States, we've had this movement called the Tea Party. So the Tea Party, how do you describe the Tea Party? They are complicated. They're not exactly Republican, not quite libertarian. They're sort of a mix in between. They tend to oppose a lot of the Republican Party, but have some of the inclinations. The Tea Party grew up out of the Obama first administration and complicated the Republican Party's, how do I put this, their kind of system here the last set of years. A guy named Rand Paul, who's running for president this election cycle, really is one of a set of Tea Partiers. A guy named Ted Cruz is another one. Not a fan of Ted. So they embody, actually what's interesting is Rand Paul is one kind of Tea Partier, and Ted Cruz is another kind, and they are very different. But the point then is, I had a PhD student who was really interested to study the Tea Party and wanted to look at Tea Party websites and discussion forums around the United States to try to understand, who are these people, what are their values, why have they created a new party, when in the United States the idea of more than more than two parties, the idea of more than two parties is pretty weird. So I don't know what Americans would do with the Brazilian system, but too confusing, I think, most Americans. Like, I don't understand all these parties. So spending time with these communities and sort of living and breathing with them, reading their forums, talking to them through email, trying to interview them, which is what one of my students did, to really understand the community and what has motivated them. Co-participation, go to rallies, spend time on the discussion forums. Being anonymous, especially as an ethnographer, is really questionable, because ethnographers tend to, by being part of the community, they tend to reveal aspects of the community that the community may not know or may not like to see. And so being anonymous even is another form of betrayal in that process. And most importantly, this is very hard sometimes to remember, but again, the community may not be only online. The Tea Party mostly meets offline. They meet in churches, they meet in people's houses, at cafes and coffee shops. So if you're only studying the message boards and the websites, you are missing a huge piece about what makes this community a community. And that is really important with ethnography. Interviews. So some of you may end up doing interviews as part of another sort of project, maybe as surveys or as part of ethnography, you will do interviews. Interviews, typically what you're trying to do is measure perceptions or motivations or attitudes of a small sample. Typically with interviews, you're not trying to generalize to a population. Again, you're trying to get thick description, the Geertzian sense. Clifford Geertz, one of the kind of more prominent advocates for ethnographic research, talks about the importance of thick description. The idea of thick description is that you can describe the community so well that if the community were to read your description, they would recognize it as their own. That requires a lot of detail, a lot of understanding of the people that you're trying to study. So, It's essential then to build rapport. If you've ever done interviews, you know that it can be hard to get people to really open up and share with you the things they're thinking about. Again, if I wanted to try to understand why do trolls or harassers become harassers, that's actually one of the things I would love to do. I would love to spend some time interviewing the men and sometimes the women who spend time harassing other people online. But how the heck would I build enough rapport to let those folks actually talk to me and let me into their motivations? Very challenging to do. My dissertation, which was done many more years than I care to count ago, I wanted to understand why people talk politics on the internet. In the United States, it's kind of a taboo to talk politics with people that you don't know. In fact, there's two things that are taboo in terms of talking with strangers. Politics and, anybody gets a second? Religion, yes, exactly. Don't talk about politics, don't talk about religion, because it only gets you into fights. But we're a democracy, right? Democracy requires that people are thinking and talking and getting perspectives that are different from their own. So if there is this taboo, then what do people do? Well, you go online. It becomes a channel, event, a place to do this. So I interviewed 69 people who talk politics only on the internet to try to understand why they do this. But building rapport with people that you've never met, you've never talked to before, you've contacted them out of the blue to say, hi, I'm a PhD student at the University of Pennsylvania, I'd really like to talk to you, what do you think? Hard to get them to say, okay, now what do you want to know? And really get them to open up. Very challenging to do. There is this problem of how do you know you're actually interviewing the person that you want to be interviewing? How do you get the depth and needed insight to really get to that thick description, to get into the minds of people and understand what drives them to do the things that they do? So some suggestions. Now this one seems kind of silly, be flexible, but I'm serious. You have to and again, advising PhD students, you get the plan, right? They got this vision, this is the set of things they're gonna do, these are the questions, these are the people. And then they start. And then they discover they can't get the people, the questions aren't working, I don't have a dissertation, and they're freaking out. So flexibility is really essential when you're doing any research, really, but especially with interviews, because you need to try, in fact, I'm gonna jump to this one for a sec, to use the channels of communication that the people you want to talk to are most comfortable in. Internet research methods. But when you want to really learn from people, they don't type that much. They just don't. Unless you're a speedy typer, you're never going to get as much information and detail out of them as if you just talked to them and heard their stories. Unfortunately, if they're talking to you by phone or by Skype, then you have to transcribe. And what a relief. Transcribing is a bitch. So, have you ever had to do transcribing by hand? One of the worst, horrible things ever. Horrible. So, that's one of the reasons why we love to do interviews by email, because you have a transcript. But convenience won't get you the quality that you're looking for. So just keep that in mind. If you are choosing to use digital technologies, maybe interview over time. So that you, in fact, that's what I did with the people who wanted to be interviewed by email. I would send them 4 or 5 questions, and then they would send the answers back. And then I'd send a couple of more, and then follow up with, because sometimes people would say something interesting in an email response that I wanted to know more about. And so I would send back and say, can you tell me more about this thing that you're talking about? Trying to draw more out of them. The challenge, of course, is getting people to keep responding to you. Because again, at some point, like, okay, check, I'm done. Not talking to you anymore. And if you can, observe behavior to corroborate that what you are getting from the interviews actually seems to match with what you're seeing the people that you're interested in actually doing. And I've included some citations here. If you're doing the short course, we're going to be reading these things in the class. Actually, there's one here, though, we won't be talking about. But if you have any questions about any of the citations or cannot access them, feel free to email me or send me a tweet, and I will get you that material. Okay, I'm only going to talk very briefly about one quantitative method. I could say a lot. I will say a little bit more about content analysis in a minute. What I want to talk about right now are surveys. So typically, and by surveys, you can use survey-type methods to get qualitative data. But I'm thinking here specifically about the survey method where ultimately you want to try to predict relationships between variables of interest. So perhaps you're interested in a relationship between people's attitudes towards politics or politicians, their likelihood or frequency of talking politics, and the likelihood that they vote. And so you want to understand, maybe your hypothesis is that people who are talking politics online and are distrustful of politicians will be more likely to vote. That's when you would want to use surveys. You want to then also, ideally, with good surveys, generalize to a population. Traditional survey methods, right, so the public opinion polls that predict outcomes of elections or predict people's attitudes on policy matters, they only survey anywhere from 800 to 1,200 people as a random sample of people in the population, so that they can, if it's a good random sample, you have enough people that are representative enough of the population to be able to infer, using statistics, what the attitudes of that entire population is, based on the sample. So the beauty and the challenge of surveys is getting a good representative sample of your population. If you do not have a representative sample of your population, you have a bad survey. You cannot generalize from that. You do not know ultimately whether your data represents effectively the population of interest. So if you want to predict, like for example, I don't know, the UK election that happened last year, you might have caught the news of the public opinion polls. Not so good. They did a very bad job predicting the UK election. We've had problems in the United States, 2012, of public opinion polls not doing a very good job, actually signaling a much stronger Republican outcome in 2012 than actually happened, leading to this beautiful meltdown by a guy named Karl Rove, who is a political operative and politician, who literally had a meltdown on Fox News on election night when he found out that his prediction that Romney would win Florida wasn't coming to pass. He literally had a meltdown. It's a beautiful thing. He stormed down to the statistics people, the cameras following him all the way to the basement. I don't understand. I predicted Florida. Your sample was bad, Carl. Okay, so representativeness, I think that would have enough. Response rate, particularly with the internet. So when you're doing internet methods, how the hell do you get a representative sample? What's your population? All Facebook users? Are all Facebook users, United States Americans, or here Brazilians? I can tell you that actually in the United States almost, about 80% of internet users are on Facebook. And in the United States, 85% of Americans have access to the internet, either through their computers or through their phones. So, getting pretty close. It's as good as cable television in the United States. Twitter. Oh, my favorite. So Twitter. What proportion of Brazilians are on Twitter? Do you know?
Less than 30%.
30? Yeah. So in the United States, it's depending on people's mood when they answer the question, it's about 20%. 20% of Americans, or 20% of internet users. So 15% of the US population, give or take, is actually on Twitter. But holy hell, the number of research studies coming out right now, or trying to come out right now, that look only at Twitter as the place where political action, activity, attitudes, opinions, you have people who are sure that they can predict the next election by studying only the opinions expressed on Twitter. But representatives, they're not representative. They're just not. They're weird people who use Twitter. How many of you are using Twitter? You are weird people. And access. So when you're trying to survey people, so I tried to do this. That was one of the challenges actually with the interviews, but the same with polls, the surveys. How do you actually get to the people? So, with Twitter, if you really wanted to survey Twitter users, how do you do that? Right, their email addresses are not on their accounts, rarely, so you can't get to them that way. You can't direct message them if you're not a friend with them and they a friend with you, or a follower, I should say. So you can't DM them. The only way is to basically send them at messages and say, hey, I'm talking to you. Pay attention to me. Hey, can you come answer the survey? And there's actually a guy named Christian Bakari who is doing that. He's a European researcher. He's at Royal Holloway in the UK. He's developed a system that basically does that. So he'll pull down 50,000 Twitter accounts who are talking about the European, say the Italian election or the British election that just happened. And he'll send out 50,000 messages to these people saying, hey, hi, researcher here. Can I just talk to you for a minute? And his response rate, more like 2%, 3%. But when you send out 50,000 invitations or more, and you get 2%, you get like 1,500 people to answer your survey. Not representative of Twitter users or the public. But that's one way to access them. So, Kevin Wright has a nice paper that talks about some of the challenges and opportunities in traditional surveys. One of his suggestions is actually to do both. That is, field an online survey and a traditional survey to see if you're getting the same responses. Because if it turns out that the people that you're interested in, or the behavior that you're interested in, when people are answering those questions online, if they also look like the people offline, maybe there's no problem here. Replicate, do the online survey multiple times to see if you continue to get the same results. Now, one of the things I've done in the past, many moons ago, was to see if I could actually work with administrators of forums to get email addresses, to then contact people by email and say, hi, researcher here. Because email is still a pretty effective way. Not awesome, but a better way than, say, bugging people by Twitter. Christian was saying the number of complaints he gets when he fields these surveys through Twitter, people saying, hey, why the hell are you spamming me? University of Bologna. Right, it doesn't look so good for the University of Bologna. Okay. Another suggestion is to offer that you're going to share your results with the community that you want to survey, so that they get some goodwill and know that what you're doing to and with them actually, is going to help them in some fashion. Okay, so how are we doing here? Okay. So opportunities for new methods. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some innovations that have happened in digital methods. The first is trace ethnography. So, as I mentioned to you, one of the challenges when you're doing ethnographic research is the artifacts that allow you to understand how a community works. Stuart Geiger and David Regs, who wrote a very nice paper in 2011 on trace ethnography, they've been studying Wikipedia, which is a really interesting site for study. It is by far, think about it, when you do a Google search on any sort of facty thing, what comes up first? Almost always, good old Wikipedia. Right? It is now this amazing repository of the collective information. It's a beautiful example of the ideals of the internet. Never mind that women don't participate, they don't. And that's one of the puzzles, actually, for these guys, is to understand why it is that women and minorities are significantly less likely to be editors and active in the Wikipedia community. Have you ever done editing in Wikipedia? No? Okay, a couple of you. Three dudes. Okay. I'm not blaming you guys. You're good. So one of the things that they've been interested in is thinking about, because one of the affordances of Wikipedia for studying it as a community is that you can see the revision history on Wikipedia. So if you were ever bored someday, when you go to a entry, you can go to the history. And if you look at the history, you can see the revisions that have been made on an entry. And if you look at the revisions, you can see the conversations that people have had about the revisions. And so on sites, on entries in Wikipedia that have been very controversial, Tea Party is one, George Bush is another, very controversial in the United States. Those places are sites of contestation. And Gamergate, another lovely example of a heavily contested entry in Wikipedia. And so these guys wanted to understand this community from this perspective. And so trace ethnography, the idea behind it is to look at and observe these editing practices, the revisions, to look at, in this case with Wikipedia, the rules and the norms. They've also looked at the different software and applications that editors have developed to make editing and monitoring this particular knowledge base possible and effective. So in looking at the editing histories, looking at the conversations, the institutional documents, it allows them to thickly describe what is happening in this community. You can then potentially use trace ethnography to move offline. You can begin to ask people who are editors, you can interview them and talk with them and show them some of these conversations and edits and ask them what it means and why they're doing what they're doing. And from their point of view, it allows the researcher to see the lived experiences of the people in this community. That is, if you're an editor on Wikipedia, you are embedded, if you will, in the management of this knowledge base. And the, part of, I actually got into a bit of a tiff once with an editor because I made a bunch of revisions to an entry because the entry was basically plagiarized, lifted word for word from another website. So I went in and I made edits, cleaning up the plagiarism, putting it into my own words. The editor reverted, went back to the plagiarism. Why? So that's what I said. Why would you do this? It's like, well, the original copy was fine. No reason to change it. So my comment back, but it's plagiarized. Response. The site that was plagiarized did not complain. Therefore, there's no issue here. Really? Okay, fine. I'm done fighting with you. But as a researcher, I could go back in, see this exchange, and try to sort of imagine then what it must be like for the people who are living in this community and engaging in these practices. So now I want to talk about surveys. So one of the challenges, as we've talked about for surveys, is representativeness. And so one of the efforts has been to build these panels. Actually, have any of you been recruited to participate on a panel? The invitation often comes from a company that says that they would like for you to participate for 6 months or a year in a panel. In exchange for answering surveys once a month, you're going to get goodies, rewards, discounts for movies or food or clothing. And so a remarkable number of people sign up for these panels. But the benefit of these is that you get a large pool. And so if you want to, again, understand some behavior, like whether or not political discussion leads to greater political participation, this sample that's pulled from this large pool may allow you to generalize to the population because there's so many people in this pool. And if you know that the population of interest has particular profiles in terms of age or gender, education levels, ethnicity, then the sample that's pulled from the pool can look like or represent the larger population. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about probably what is my favorite and most hated method at the same time, content analysis. How many of you have done content analysis? Systematic content analysis? And you live to tell the tale? I actually think in categories now. Like randomly, I study a lot of discourse, so I'll be tagging things as people are talking. Oh, that's a question. Oh, that's declarative. Oh, that's a disagreement. Hey, there's an agreement. Very irritating. Okay, so in the good old or bad old days, we code humans. I had a PhD student, she defended last year. Her dissertation, she wanted to understand how contemporary news media in the United States cover female politicians. There's a lot of news coverage, a lot of analysis of female candidates. So Hillary Clinton, I bet you money there'll be at least 2 dissertations that are written about Hillary Clinton and her run in 2016. There definitely was for her run in 2008. So very little, though, on female politicians once they get into office. And we haven't been lucky enough to actually have a female president. But maybe we'll get a chance here sometime soon. But we have governors who have female governors. And so my PhD student, Lauren Bryant, she collected the newspapers. She studied 15 states where there were female governors, and in 15 states where there were male governors, so 30 states in all. She looked over 10 years of time comparing the news coverage of male and female politicians, and then she coded all of that news content. I think she coded something like 70,000 paragraphs. A lot of content analysis. It took her a year with her dad, just kind of cute. So rudimentary lexicons, so there are qualitative data packages where you can buy kind of bags of words that then you can do some analysis for topics. But nowadays, thanks to computers, we have much more sophisticated lexicons. So the Facebook study, the social contagion study, is interesting because it would not have been possible without Luke, which is a lexicon of words that have been identified by psychologists and sort of validated with college students answering lots of questions about the emotion that particular words invoke, like violin, cloud. So you typically think, well, these emotional words are going to be like love, hate, sex, fun, kill. Actually, interestingly, in Luke, I've looked at a lot of this, Luke doesn't actually have death, kill, or murder in its lexicon. Really? But violin is there. And I don't know if that's positive or negative. I mean, for me, violin's neutral. And maybe if you were forced as a kid to play the violin and you hated it, maybe it's negative. Anyway, I don't have a lot of faith in these. I'll talk more about that in a second. Anyway, so now Luke and these lexicons, bags of words, that you can then basically run, books and books and books of text, or in this case, Facebook, to begin to see what the positive or negative words are in people's Facebook messages. You can then do this magical thing called machine learning. In fact, actually, Patricia has been helping me a bit. We're working on a project right now, first on a pilot of governor's data from 2014, that is candidates who ran for governor in 2014 in the United States. And now we're working on doing the same for the presidential election for 2016. We're collecting all the Facebook and Twitter messages by the candidates. 17 men and 1 woman on a stage all together at the same time to debate. What does that look like? It didn't. Instead, they had 2 debates, one with 10, one with 7. Facebook partnered with the news company, Fox News, to analyze the public's sentiment around these candidates and the debate. So the idea of sentiment analysis is, again, you're taking something like Luke and running lots of messages through that, and then tagging each message for whether it's positive, negative, or neutral. So this is an example. This is actually from 2014, so this is how long we have to suffer through presidential elections in the United States. 2 years. Actually, what amazes me is anybody knows the name of Scott Walker or Ted Cruz in 2014. Or Paul Ryan, even. So the idea here is that the dark red is positive. I don't know why they pick these, anyway. I don't know why they pick these colors, right? For red is negative in my sort of association with colors, but nevertheless, they are the Republicans. The representation of the Republican Party in the U.S. is now red. All goes back to 2000. I won't go into that. Right now, Democrats are blue. Why? So positive is red, negative is white, and neutral is pink. And so back in 2014, when nobody in the United States is paying any attention to the 2016 election, here is the absolutely unvalid, unrepresentative view of no Americans paying attention to the candidates. So how do you do with this? I don't know. The problem with sentiment analysis is it's not very accurate. So Facebook, there are a number of companies that are now offering sentiment analysis to companies. And it feels like this magic box of amazing analysis of now you know what the public thinks, positive or negative for a candidate. But again, it goes back to the bag of words. Remember, murder isn't in Luke. Violin is. What does that mean? Right, and so, and I've done this. I've used different, so there's Senti strength, there's Luke, there's something called Anu, 3 different lexicons, entirely different volumes of words. Luke has something like 10,000 words in it. Senti strength has more like 1,200 words. You run the same text through, you get totally different results. So, be aware and be cautious of any study that you see, especially on politics. Do you know why? Because we do a lot of humor and irony in politics. Machines do not read irony. They don't know how to pick it up yet. There will be dissertations that are going to change that, but right now we still cannot read irony. And so, how accurate is this? It's not, so don't trust it. The other is social network analysis. So this social network analysis is also very hot right now because, again, you can pull down all these Facebook messages or Twitter. You can see who's responding to whom. You can see who's retweeting and forwarding messages to their friends. So you can start to actually map relationships between people. But it's not new. So this atom-etching glance is actually from like 1999. And this is a visual representation of network analysis. So network analysis is just trying to show visually the relationships between people. So if I retweet a message from Patricia, then there's some relationship between us. And if then Patricia retweets it, if my friends retweet it, then you can start to build this network of who's related to whom in this network, how far away people are. The atom-etching glance, that's actually blogs. Remember blogs? Remember how cool they used to be back in 2004 and 2005? So this is from about that period. This is actually, again, red and blue. You might be able to guess it's America, so red is Republican, blue is Democrat. The question here is, do Republicans and Democrats talk to each other on blogs? The answer is no, right? So this is a sampling of political blogs from across the kind of digital spectrum in the United States. And they find basically, this group in the middle are kind of, you can't really tell. So blue people talk to blue people, red people talk to red people. And you can see there's very little crossover. This is blogs. This is Mark Smith stuff. This is an even older technology, although a newer paper, interestingly. So this, do you remember Usenet? Anybody old enough to remember Usenet? Oh, I did. So my dissertation was on Usenet groups as well as message boards and synchronous chat. And Usenet, so Google groups. Any of you been involved in a Google group? A couple of you have. So Google groups are just ways, kind of basically to create email forums with a web platform that people can go and post to instead if they don't want the email. It's a way for people to talk basically in a threaded, asynchronous way. Before Google Groups, actually, Google bought Usenet. So Usenet actually is one of the oldest after-email discussion platforms. Usenet sort of followed out of bulletin board systems from the late 80s, early 90s. So Usenet was around from about 1989 until about, 2002, I believe. Nobody studies Usenet groups or Google groups, but there's still a lot of people using them. So Mark Smith, he did a network analysis looking at Google groups, Usenet groups, Talk.abortion, which is a discussion about abortion, and Alt.politics Bush, discussion about our good old buddy Bush. And what he finds is not what Adamich and Glantz find. He finds that Republicans and Democrats, and he's got a whole system for how he coded this, are in fact talking to each other in these Usenet discussion forums. Very different kind of result. Which is also kind of interesting. It suggests that platform to platform, you can't necessarily assume the same kinds of discussion practices that are happening in one platform are happening in another, because the affordances, remember that whole representativeness thing? The users are different on it. Usenet users, so for me, for my dissertation, Usenet, the average age of a Usenet user was 40. The average age of a message board user that I interviewed was 35, and for synchronous chat, it was 25. That's the average age. Very different demographic characteristics, leading to different kinds of motivations. But the thing I want you to take away is that you can't tell the meaning of these relationships. So you can only see the Republicans and Democrats are discussing with each other, but you have no idea what that means or how they interpret what's happening. And the thing that is most important to remember is that with social network analysis, it is descriptive. Descriptive, you're describing relationships. You're not predicting them. And this is one of the things sometimes my students get a bit confused by. They want to somehow predict relationships. But this is it's descriptive. You're just describing how people are engaging with each other. Okay, almost done, I promise. So, ethics. Going back then to that discussion, what I really, really want you to take away from this discussion today is that you need to know your data, and you need to understand and remember that there are people behind that data. So I pulled this last night. This is from Hillary Clinton's Twitter account. So Hillary had a speech on Monday last week announcing a new plan for students to be able to pay for college. As you might know, in the United States, it is horrifically expensive to go to college. The average debt of a college student in the United States is $22,000. So you graduate in 4.5 or 5 years, you're in $22,000 in debt. There are people who are paying off college loans when they're now having to pay for their children to go to college. My brother got a law degree after his bachelor's degree. He and his wife carry a collective $200,000 of debt. That's more than their mortgage for their house. So it's a huge problem in the United States. Most politicians in the US do not touch this topic. So Clinton has a plan, and she has been tweeting about it very actively on her account. And so, actually, the reason I picked this one is I love the two comments. So you've got the first one, whatever, bride lady. I thought it was something else, actually. And then you've got this other one, now you're talking. Completely different perspectives. Now, I'm currently working with a computer scientist who, again, we're collecting all of these comments, the posts by the candidate, all of the comments. And, you know, sometimes my colleagues, they don't see that there are living people behind those comments. They just see the comments, and they're really interested to look at the relationships between the commenters and their attitudes, but just as data. But you need to really understand, like, why did Ronald Camaro decide to post this? What does that mean? I can analyze the content, but I don't know what or why people are doing what they're doing. And I can't just watch the Twitter feed to try to understand that. I have to talk to them. And that requires a level of commitment to your, to the data enterprise, to the research that, you know, I hate to say this, but I think it's true. We're human. Humans are lazy. Researchers are lazy. Therefore, humans do lazy research. Social media, do you like that little syllogism? So there is, and social media makes it easier for us to be lazy. We can just suck this, hoover all this text down, run some algorithms over it, ta-da! We now know what people are saying on Twitter. Really? Do we know? And more importantly, what does it mean to them? And how do we make sure when we do this that we're behaving ethically? So I have a rule. So we're studying politicians. Politicians are completely fair game. I got IRB approval. IRB, you guys have this too, I know. You have to, if you're studying human subjects, you need to make sure you're engaging ethically. So there is a board whose job it is to make sure you are not torturing your subjects, participants. Politicians, because they're public actors, are not subject to such concerns. So my research for this project is exempt. That is, I'm not really studying humans. It's kind of a funny irony of this, because politicians somehow are not human. But when I collect these messages, right, I also get the comments. The comments are coming from ordinary people who are not politicians, who are in fact human and are subject to the rules of human subjects. My RV doesn't see it that way, interestingly, because it's Twitter, it's all public. If it's publicly available, not subject to oversight by human subjects boards. But what happens if, I don't know, Ray Livingston here, let's say Ray Livingston's a Republican. Let's say that for some reason he is absolutely smitten with Hillary Clinton and he's totally on board this election cycle to get her elected. He tweets out comments, the Hillary Clinton campaign retweets those. So they're part of kind of her account. And let's say 2 years from now, Ray wants to get a job with the Republican Party. Some candidate really excited by him, wants to run, help him out and win. But campaign manager looks at Ray Livingston's Twitter feed and sees that Hillary Clinton in 2016 retweeted a message of his. He wouldn't get the job because, at least in the United States, if you're not loyal to your party, you're not going to work for that party. And if you've been sort of loyal to the other side, you're not coming over. So poor Ray here might unwittingly end up getting himself out of a job. If a researcher like me is analyzing this stuff, pulls a quote from Ray right now and puts it into a paper. So there's some kind of connection between Ray, his message, the Hillary Clinton campaign, and how everything is public these days. And then it gets visible to, again, the campaign in 2018 who wants to hire Ray. What I'm saying to you is that as a researcher, you don't always know when what you're doing as research will produce harm for the people that you're studying. Ray may or may not want me to be talking about him in my papers. He probably doesn't want me using his name in my papers. He probably doesn't want me quoting him in my papers because, again, because of that historical nature, if people enter in the message that's in the paper, even if I don't attribute it to Ray, he might still come up in his quote and be identified. So we have to be very thoughtful about this. So my students think I'm a little nutty about this, but we cannot include direct quotes from Twitter in any of our papers. We paraphrase them so that people are not identified. I also forbid, actually I probably have a slide on this, I think I do. I forbid people to email our data sets or put them on the cloud. I'm actually violating that right now. I have it set on Dropbox, Google Drive rather. Stupid Google. Why are you so easy? So and the reason for that is if you put data in the cloud, you don't own it anymore. The company, Google, technically, read the terms of use. Nobody ever does. If you do, they own it. Be careful. So, respect the rights and feelings of those being studied. Protect their interests and their rights. There are people, there are consequences you cannot predict. You need to weigh the benefits to science with the costs and the harms to participants. And as I said, don't share data with third parties. Do not email or store data on cloud systems. By the way, if you collect Twitter, so we run into this issue, in sort of ingesting all this Twitter data, the terms of use say that I cannot share it with anybody else. So if you came to me and said, oh, you have the best Twitter data set, I really want it, I would have to say you have to go get your own. I cannot share it with you because Twitter says I cannot. So the terms of use are as important in some cases as the participants because you don't want to be sued. The last thing I want to say is about privacy. Because each individual has a different notion about what privacy means to them. For some, if you're teaching, have fun with your undergraduates and ask them to spend a little bit of time talking with you about what they feel is private and what's not online, you get such different answers. I have some undergrads who, for them, everything is public and they don't care. I have other students who, they are horrified at the idea that really anything is visible to the public. They've shut down and closed off their Facebook accounts so that nobody that's public can see them. So these notions of what privacy means to individuals are individual. And so you have to be thinking about that when you're doing research. Do not assume that just because it's on Facebook or Twitter, it's public. We tend to do this as researchers because that's convenient for us to do so. But that's not ethical, because we're not taking into consideration the perspectives and norms of the people that we are researching. So, as a case in point, in 2005, Harvard got into big trouble. This is a headline from the Chronicle of Higher Education in the United States. Harvard researchers accused of breaching students' privacy. Social network project shows promise and peril of doing social science online. So here's what happened. So these are researchers at Harvard in 2005. 2005 Harvard, you ring a bell? What happened in 2005 at Harvard? Actually, sorry, that's not true. 2002? Zuckerberg, that kid, remember him? Might have heard of him, sort of a multi-trillionaire. Invented that thing called the Facebook at Harvard, that guy. So he, when he left Harvard, didn't finish his degree, he started Facebook. In the early days of Facebook, it was only available to college students, right? So you had to have a .edu email address to be able to have a Facebook page. And so Harvard, the researchers there are like, ooh, we really want to understand how users' Facebook uses change over time. That is from, say, 2005 to 2010. If you study a cohort of students from freshman year through senior year, from first year to fourth year, how do their Facebook uses change? Now, I have to tell you, as a researcher, oh man, I want to know that. I really do. How do these uses change? It's a great question. So the researchers hired undergraduates. The researchers themselves couldn't collect the Facebook pages of the Harvard students because they didn't have access. They hired undergrads. The undergrads at Harvard, of course, had access to the Facebook at Harvard. And so they had the students, the undergrads' accounts, and used those to collect all of Harvard's students' Facebook pages. Then they made that archive, that collection, public. But they anonymized it. It was some Northeast university. There aren't that many undergraduates at Harvard. And a guy named Michael Zimmer, and actually some others, accessed this publicly available data set. And within about an hour, were able to identify which students, their names, their addresses, their birth dates, their partners, their families, their friends. Right, so within an hour, this anonymous database of Facebook users who might be from Harvard were now obviously Harvard students. And not just anonymous Harvard students, but like that particular Harvard student. Huge backlash over this because, well, gee, I don't know, starting with getting undergrads, accessing undergrads and using their accounts to collect your data, not so ethical to start. Right, huge backlash again about what people feel comfortable with doing research. So going all the way back to the social contagion, that Facebook emotional contagion study, your reactions, for the most part, were negative to thinking about Facebook manipulating your newsfeed. So you guys, as research participants, do not want to be research participants in Facebook's studies without your consent, without you knowing this. So just Just because it's on Facebook and Twitter does not mean that it's public, does not mean that it's ethical, and does not mean that you might end up a major headline in a newspaper for having violated people's expectations of what it means to be ethical and to do ethical research. Well, that was heavy. Didn't mean to quite end it quite so seriously. But on that point, I'd be curious if you've got questions or discussion or reactions to any of this. I'm very open to your curiosities.